Hello and welcome to my channel, I Win to Lose Gaming. It's about time. Kaedehara Kazuha is finally getting his long-awaited rerun. In today's video, we'll be going over 61 things to consider for our favorite Ronin samurai. We have yet another entry for our The Brutal Truth About Insert Character Here series, Mr. Kaedehara Kazuha. And starting off with a fun fact, I'm pretty sure Kazuha is the character with the longest time between his initial release and his first rerun. He was released back on June 29th, 2021, and it isn't until over an entire year later, on July 13th, I believe, when 2.8 hits, 2022, that he's finally coming back. But really quick, it's time to pay some bills, and today's sponsor is DNF Duel. The outrageously popular and successful Dungeon Fighter Online is now back as an action-packed 2.5D fighting game called DNF Duel. Arc System Works, the king of making legendary anime-style fighting games like Guilty Gear and Dragon Ball FighterZ, is doing it again with DNF Duel. Bask in the dazzling full-screen attacks and high-quality character models that only Arc System Works has mastered. There's no shortage of things to do in DNF Duel with its tried-and-true core gameplay modes like Story Mode, Arcade Mode, Survival Mode, Practice Mode, and a highly optimized online mode. If you're worried about lag, don't be. DNF Duel uses state-of-the-art rollback netcode to ensure low lag and seamless multiplayer experience. So as long as your modem isn't a potato, you'll experience some of the best latency for a fighting game ever. Online multiplayer will have a convenient, simplified matching system to ensure low queues and exciting matches, with others also on standby. And if you're not the type to enjoy getting all sweaty in competitive multiplayer, the game has plenty of single-player story content and modes where you'll learn tons about the characters and their extensive lore. DNF Duel is available now to purchase once and play forever. Smash that link down below and start dueling today. Huge thanks to DNF Duel for sponsoring today's video. We all know that Kazuha is one of the best characters in the entire game. And if you didn't know that, well, newsflash, he's one of the best characters in the entire game. We'll get started with one of the things that absolutely defines him, his elemental skill, Chihaya Buru. I have a feeling that I'm going to need a couple screens of text for his elemental skill. But anyway, let's get the most obvious thing about it out of the way. It is one of the easiest and most reliable ways to activate his second passive, which when swirled will buff Pyro, Electro, Cryo, and Hydro damage, based on these swirled elements. And I'll be calling this Pyro, Electro, Cryo, and Hydro Petch for short moving forward because I don't want to say Pyro, Electro, Cryo, and Hydro every single time. A simple swirl will activate his passive 2, which provides an elemental damage boost to that swirled element based on his elemental mastery. For a standard free-to-play Kazuha who may have around 940 elemental mastery, this provides 37.6% elemental damage to his whole team for the swirled element. Anyway, Kazuha's elemental skill has great suction and provides ridiculously good crowd control. People often underestimate its crowd controlling capabilities because they compare it to Venti, but let me tell you, to have such a spammable grouping tool is an incredibly invaluable thing to have. Obviously, it's not a Venti tornado, but it actually has a ton of advantages over Venti's tornado. It groups enemies towards Kazuha and keeps them at ground level. This makes his grouping capabilities much more compatible with most melee characters. Venti's tornado, being the main competitor to Kazuha's elemental skill, is casted super far ahead of you, has many auto-targeting issues, and lifts many enemy types so high that a ton of characters cannot even hit them. All these problems are solved with Kazuha's E, but of course it does have its disadvantages in comparison to Venti's tornado, mostly being that it does not have as strong of continuous suction as Venti's burst does. The tap version has a reasonable AoE, while the hold version has a rather impressively large AoE. However, it is still smaller than Venti's tornado suction's AoE. Anyway, the point I'm trying to convey here is that Kazuha's elemental skill is situationally the best crowd control ability in the entire game. The tap version has a very spammable and low 6-second cooldown, and although the hold version does have a fairly long 9-second cooldown, it generates a great 3 or 4 particles for tap and hold respectively, and his Constellation 1 allows for him to do it twice in quick succession, providing him with much more energy, more crowd control, and great swirl damage. Speaking of damage, in most scenarios it swirls both on Ascension as well as on the plunge. This naturally synergizes with itself incredibly well, as the first hit will group enemies, and the plunge will then swirl them all together to wipe out groups of weak enemies. This makes Kazuha arguably the best character for disposing of groups of overworld trash mobs, and he will often even swirl multiple times with the environmental things like torches and other stuff. Kazuha's elemental skill also does good anemo damage, so it's perfectly viable, although much less common, to build him as an anemo damage dealer as well. Kazuha's hold E gives him a ton of super armor, allowing him to face tank through most things coming his way and still perform his hold elemental skill. Kazuha's elemental skill also catapults him up vertically. This can be used to dodge a lot of attacks and manipulate the enemy AI. Although on some occasions this can mess up things like against flying rune hunters who will fly into the air and the other robots that will shoot missiles at you. But most of the time you can use this in combat to your advantage. And interestingly, unlike Venti's tornado, Kazuha can pull things in like Klee's mines, Aloy's bomblets, etc. for some extra added fun. And finally, Kazuha's elemental skill is one of the best abilities for overworld exploration, and he's basically never left my party since I've gotten him for the overworld. We'll talk more about exploration benefits in the exploration section, but not everything is completely broken and amazing about Kazuha's elemental skill, Chihaya Buru, and next I'll be focusing on some of its few cons. The full animation, including the Ascension and Plunge, is a bit long for an elemental skill, taking around 1.5 to 2 seconds for the tap and hold respectively, and more importantly, the plunge portion of his elemental skill can cause issues, like knocking back certain enemies like Vishaps and big wolves. The plunge also shatters frozen enemies, but of course, Kazuha, being one of the best characters in the entire game, actually has a workaround for one of his few shortcomings, which is the plunge issues, as he can glide cancel the tap version of his elemental skill to avoid the plunge and still descend very quickly. I haven't been able to glide cancel his hold E version, so there is that to keep in mind. And my god, that was just Kazuha's elemental skill, and I'm already tired of talking so much. We've got a lot more to talk about, but fortunately the next section, his basic attacks, is going to be a very short section. Kazuha's basic attacks, Garyu Blade Work, is the most unremarkable part of his kit, despite looking pretty cool. Now unfortunately, the anemo infused plunge damage of his elemental skill actually scales off his basic attack talent level, so unfortunately in order to get the most out of Kazuha's elemental skill, you do need to level up his basic attacks. But this isn't absolutely necessary, as overall his plunge damage does not make up the majority of his damage output. And after such a nice short section, we're about to get to another long one again as we talk about Kazuha's epically and pragmatically named elemental burst, Kazuha Slash. Like many anemo elemental bursts, Kazuha's Slash infuses elements, and in terms of his burst's elemental infusion priority, it goes Pyro, Hydro, Electro, then Cryo. And unfortunately it has a longish animation of around 1.5 seconds. It has no ICD on its swirls and thus swirls every time it ticks. Including the initial slash and then the 5 follow-up ticks of his burst, it swirls 6 times total and applies the infused element. It gets a bit confusing in terms of its tick-swirl interaction with elements already on the enemy, but fortunately it doesn't matter in most situations. What's especially nice about his burst is that it activates Kazuha's second passive's bonus damage buff even while he's off-field. This allows your on-field character to focus even more on doing damage without worrying about dropping Kazuha's passive too. Similar to his elemental skill, Kazuha's burst has good damage multipliers, and it's perfectly viable to build him to do anemo damage. Another advantage his elemental burst has is that Kazuha is able to do his elemental skill and then his elemental burst and still catch the particles from his elemental skill. This helps a lot with his energy management and saving some field time. Unfortunately though, because Kazuha's popular builds do not have any energy recharge weapons or energy recharge timepieces, sometimes he does struggle to get his burst up, especially at Constellation 3 or below. Speaking of constellations, Constellation 2 is one of the best constellations in the game, as it improves the amount of damage buff that Kazuha provides during his burst, as well as boosting the on-field character's elemental mastery by 200 while they're inside Kazuha's huge Kazuha Slash. But not everything is perfect, because enemies near the edge of his burst can be knocked out of his elemental burst and also thus outside of his hold E range by the initial slash, which can be an issue. This can provide a dilemma for non-Constellation 1 Kazuha owners needing to decide if they use their elemental skill before or after his burst for optimal grouping. Finally, I find Kazuha's burst to be very visually impairing. The auto-targeting and cutscene and difficulty to see beyond the burst has led me to almost running off some domain cliffs or struggling to find where the exit is or being disoriented in terms of positioning for many Abyss runs. We've gone through most of his combat capabilities, so now let's talk about my personal favorite thing about him, his exploration capabilities. Kazuha is hands down one of the best characters for overworld exploration. There is nothing that can rival his vertical mobility in midair thanks to his elemental skill. He'll be able to grab so many difficult to grab oculuses or things like that. You can instantly adjust the direction of flight, you can glide to never before glidable places thanks to all the additional height he gains while gliding, you can extend your glide distance tremendously, you can easily fix errors that would otherwise require you to climb up a whole bunch, and really the possibilities are endless. On top of all that, Kazuha has the best passive for exploration in my opinion, which is 20% reduction to stamina consumption while dashing. Combine this with the fact that he's Anemo, just slap on another Anemo teammate like Sayu, who also covers healing, and now you've got Anemo Resonance, which further reduces stamina consumption by another 15% and increases movement speed by 10% and reduces cooldowns by 5%. This all leads to extremely enhanced efficiency for overworld exploration and has saved me countless hours over the last year that I've owned Kazuha. Oh yeah, he can climb infinitely with his elemental skill, and his elemental skill even groups up monster carcasses drops, so you don't have to run around picking up each individual item all around the area. Lastly, Kazuha allows you to catch many fleeing crystal flies, and frankly the only disadvantage of using Kazuha in the overworld is that I've gotten so dependent on using him that I cannot not use him for the overworld after using him for so long. The next topic I always talk about, and the brutal truth about insert character here is Kazuha free-to-play friendly? And the sad answer to that is absolutely yes. Yes, to the point where Kazuha is one of the best characters in the entire game at almost all levels of investment for pretty much anyone's account. He is one of the best Constellation 0 characters in the game, and he has amazing Constellations 1 and 2. Admittingly, his Constellations 3, 4, and 5 are pretty mediocre, and his Constellation 6, while good, has its opportunity costs. Now, despite being exceptionally free-to-play friendly, building him is a bit trickier than most other pure support characters, since you really want Elemental Mastery main stat, Timepiece, Goblet, and Circlet. And you also really want the 4-piece Viridescent Veneer. This leads to the rather resin inefficient Viridescent Veneer and Maiden's Dungeon, but once you get 2 out of the 3 Timepiece, Goblet, and Circlet Elemental Mastery main stats, you can move on to a more resin efficient dungeon. As for weapons, well, his obvious best in slot is the Freedom Sworn, which catapults his team buff above and beyond pretty much anything any other character can provide. However, even with the craftable Iron Sting, Kazuha is still insanely good. Again, this is a character that is invaluable at all levels of investment, and even though my Kazuha is currently only at Constellation 2, whereas all my other 5 stars are at Constellation 6, I use him literally all the time for all the content in the game. Now for some miscellaneous tidbits before we get to the overall summary. Being Anemo and being able to infuse his burst, he is one of the best characters for breaking elemental shields. His high swirl rate and large AoE also help in this regard. Kazuha is ubiquitously the best in slot buffer for so many different Petch teams, including but not limited to the Child International team, Hyper Carry Raiden, Mono Pyro teams, Pyro Vape teams, Melt Ganyu, Freeze teams, and the list goes on. The timing of his banner is also incredibly deliberate. After an entire year for the community to have FOMO for missing out on one of the most broken characters in the game, and also, very importantly, he's here to drain your primos before the extremely likely release of Sumeru, and therefore Dendro being teased by miHoYo in the 2.8 trailer. miHoYo is definitely trying to drain our primo gems prior to the likely release of an entire new meta centered around Dendro. Anyway, this does not detract from Kazuha's usefulness, and he's likely going to remain as one of the best characters even after Dendro is released. But do keep that in mind if you're allocating your primo gems for the future. Kazuha has been used in countless speedruns and has set countless world record times and nuke damage showcases. Oh right, there are a couple cons for Kazuha as a whole. While his passive 2 works off-field, Viridescent Veneer does not. This can lead to many situations where the resistance shred from Viridescent Veneer has already expired, whereas his passive 2 is still active. This problem is slightly compounded by Kazuha's longish 1.5 to 5 second screen time, given his ability to use 2 elemental skills and his elemental burst at Constellation 1. Finally, Kazuha's limited compatibility with Anemo and Geo main DPS characters like Xiao and Ito or Noelle. He can only mainly serve as a grouper and Freedom Sworn buffer for those specific DPS characters. So now let's finally go over a full summary of all the points I've made in this video, as well as a couple bonus ones, starting with the innumerable pros that Kazuha brings. His tap E is fast to come out, his hold E has a rather large AoE, and most importantly his E pulls enemies towards you unlike Venti's Tornado. And thus, unlike Venti's Tornado, his crowd control works very well with most melee characters. He has a low 6-second cooldown for tap E, and his E generates 3 or 4 animal particles respectively for tap and hold. His E swirls twice, which does quite a lot of damage given Kazuha tends to be built purely on elemental mastery. Constellation 1 allows for 2 E's in one rotation for many added benefits. You can glide cancel to avoid tap E's plunge problems, and speaking of plunging, he infuses his plunge for more elemental application and damage. His E is one of the best tools in the entire game to kill trash mobs, and heck, his E and Q even have good anemo damage multipliers if you do choose to go the anemo damage route. His hold E has a ton of super armor, and it even pulls things in like Klee's Mines, Aloy Bombs for a bit of added fun. The vertical height his E provides is great for manipulating AI and dodging many attacks. As for his Q, it has 6 total swirls, and you're able to do E then Q and still catch the particles in time. You can continuously buff Petch elemental damage while off field via his Q ticks, and his Constellation 2 makes his burst essentially the best damage buff in the entire game for so many different characters. Kazuha has had super consistent and high usage rates ever since his release, and he is simply one of the best characters in the entire game. Kazuha is the best buffer in so many meta teams, including but not limited to International, Hyper Raiden, Freeze, Melt Ganyu, etc. And unlike most other buffers, he can effortlessly buff multiple Petch elements. He has perfect synergy with one of the best buffing weapons, the Freedom Sworn, and he has set countless world records, even at just Constellation 2. Finally, his high swirl rate and controllable Q infusion makes him one of the best elemental shield breakers in the entire game. His exploration passive is the best one in my opinion, which is sprinting stamina reduction, and he's anemo and thus provides anemo resonance, which is OP for the overworld. Kazuha provides the uncontested best vertical mobility in the game, which allows him to glide much further with his E. You can use his E for infinite climbing, use his E to group up overworld drops, use his E plunge to break ores, and use his E to even catch tons of crystal flies. All these things have saved me countless hours over the last year. He is ridiculously free to play friendly and amazing at Constellation 0, and his Constellation 1 and 2 are both amazing. His Constellation 6 is good, albeit far from necessary, and building him is relatively straightforward as you just need Elemental Mastery Viridescent Veneer pieces with some energy recharge. He also has access to some great free-to-play weapons like the Iron Sting. Now that was a ton of pros, but let's also go over his con. The radius on his tap E admittingly isn't too big, and his hold E has a longish 9-second cooldown. His E animation is actually kinda slow at around 1.5 to 2 seconds, and his crowd control is situationally worse than Venti's, particularly when a large, more prolonged crowd control situation with multiple waves is desired. His plunge can knock certain enemies away, and it can shatter frozen enemies. It's eventually recommended to waste some resources to level his basic attacks just to maximize his plunge damage. His Q's first hits can push enemies away, leading to spacing and grouping issues, and his Q has less pyro infusion application than, for example, Sunfire Gene. His Q infusion can be tricky to time due to infusion priority, and he has some energy issues, especially when he's at Constellation 3 or lower. His Q is also honestly visually very disorienting, and his Q has a longish animation at around 1.5 seconds. He has also had the longest duration between his release and his first rerun ever, so who knows when he'll ever come back. Viridescent Veneer also doesn't work off field, which leads to it not being active while his Petch buff is still active. And Kazuha brings relatively little to Geo and Anemo damage based teams like Xiao, Ito, and Noelle. He has a rather long rotation time, especially with Constellation 1's EQE rotation, which can take around 4 to 5 seconds. I've personally also become way too dependent on Kazuha for Overworld, and sadly for Dolphins, his Constellations 3, 4, and 5 aren't that great. His Constellation 6 build is very difficult to optimize, and second, my Constellation 6 Kazuha build is actually terrible, and farming for his artifacts in the Viridescent Veneer dungeon isn't resin efficient due to the Maiden's Beloved. EN timepieces, goblets, and circlets are also very rare. And last and arguably most importantly, Kazuha is coming to drain your Primo Gems before Sumeru and Dendro's likely release. So there you go, the most things ever to consider for one of these The Brutal Truth About Insert Character Here series of videos. Sorry for my lack of uploads lately, but I'll be releasing another video explaining where the heck I've been and what's been going on and my COVID-19 experience. Anyway, thank you everyone for your support and kind wishes. Oh, and don't forget to check out today's sponsor, as their sponsorships really help this channel out a ton. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Want to Lose, signing out.